Imagine a small group of people, maybe 10 or 15 of them, living together in a valley somewhere in what is now Iraq, about 65,000 years ago. They hunt together, sleep near the same fire, know each other's faces better than we know our neighbors. And one morning, one of them doesn't wake up. What do they do? This is a question most people have never seriously asked. We talk a lot about how ancient humans hunted, what they ate, where they slept. But death, the moment that changes everything for the people left behind, that part of the story gets almost no attention. So what actually happened? Did they leave the body and move on? Did they feel anything at all? Did they understand what death even was? The evidence suggests something far more interesting than most of us would expect. Let's start with what we thought we knew. For a long time, scientists assumed that ancient humans, especially the ones who came before us, like Neanderthals, didn't think much about death. The assumption was that they were too primitive, too focused on survival. Death, in that version of the story, was just another problem the group had to move past. But then people started actually digging up the places where ancient humans lived, and what they found changed everything. 1950s, an archaeologist named Ralph Solke began excavating a cave in northern Iraq called Shanidar Cave. It had been used by Neanderthals for tens of thousands of years, a natural shelter carved into a rocky hillside, deep enough to stay warm, wide enough to live in. Inside, Solke's team found something unexpected: Neanderthal skeletons, several of them, and they weren't scattered around carelessly like the remains of animals that had simply died there. They were arranged, placed. Some were in a fetal position, curled up like sleeping figures. Some had animal bones placed near them. When a soil sample from around one of the burials was analyzed, it came back showing something remarkable. Pollen, not just any pollen, pollen from at least 8 different species of flowers: grape hyacinths, yarrow, groundsel, flowers that still grow in the region today. The interpretation was striking. These Neanderthals had apparently placed flowers around their dead before burying them. Now, to be fair, some scientists later questioned whether the pollen might have been carried there naturally by burrowing rodents or wind. The debate isn't fully settled, but the burial itself, that's not in question. These bodies were placed deliberately, intentionally. That much is clear from the evidence. And Shanidar wasn't alone. In Israel, at sites called Eshkol and Kafse, archaeologists found burials of early modern humans, people like us, dating back somewhere between 90,000 and 130,000 years ago. At Kafse, a child had been buried with the antlers of a red deer laid across their arms. At Eshkol, one individual had been buried holding the jaw of a wild boar. These weren't accidents. Someone chose those objects. Someone placed them there deliberately and then covered the body, which means they were doing something we do at funerals today, placing meaningful things with the person who is gone. Think about that for a second. 100,000 years ago, before agriculture, before writing, before cities, before virtually everything we call civilization, someone stood over the grave of a child they loved and placed something in their arms because it felt like the right thing to do. That is not the behavior of a creature that doesn't understand what it's lost. About 34,000 years ago, on the banks of a river in what is now Russia, a group of modern humans buried 3 people: an older man and 2 children, a boy and a girl, placed head to head in a single grave. When archaeologists excavated these burials in the 1960s, what they found was astonishing. The bodies had been covered in more than 13,000 tiny beads carved from mammoth ivory, thousands of them stitched across the clothing. On the man, they found fox teeth arranged in a pattern that suggested a hat. Near the children, carved ivory spears, discs, fox teeth, pendants. To make 13,000 mammoth ivory beads, someone would have needed to carve and drill through ivory, one bead at a time, for an estimated 10,000 hours of work. 10,000 hours! These people spent more time preparing for the burial of 2 children than most modern companies spend building a product. That's not practicality. That's not hygiene. That's grief. That's love. That's a group of people saying, with everything they had, this mattered. This person mattered. But here's where the story gets interesting. When you look at all of this evidence together, the flower burials, the objects placed with the dead, the enormous effort at Sungir, a question keeps coming up. What did they believe was happening to the person who had died? Putting food, tools, and weapons in a grave suggests the buried person might need those things somewhere. Placing a child's favorite items with them suggests the belief that the child was going somewhere. The use of red ochre, a red pigment found smeared on many ancient burials across different sites and continents, seems to have had symbolic meaning connected to life or blood, or perhaps the act of rebirth. These aren't the actions of a group that saw death as nothing. In Spain, deep inside a mountain called the Sierra de Atapuerca, archaeologists found something extraordinary in a chamber they named Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones. Inside this pit, which can only be reached by crawling through a narrow passage and dropping down a 13-meter shaft in complete darkness, they found the remains of at least 28 individuals. Hundreds of bones, all of them ancient humans, all placed there around 430,000 years ago. There's almost no other explanation than that it was intentional. Someone, or many people over time, carried these bodies through the darkness and dropped them into the pit. Among the bones was a single hand axe, a beautiful, carefully made stone tool crafted from red quartzite found nowhere near the site. It was placed there deliberately, left with the dead. A gift, a marker, a signal to something or someone they couldn't see. That's a thought that's been a part of us for almost 500,000 years. Now here's something that doesn't get discussed enough. For most of human prehistory, the group you lived with was small. Maybe 10, maybe 30 people. You would have known every single one of them. You would have grown up alongside some of them. You would have shared food, shared fires, shared danger with all of them. When one of them died, it wasn't an abstract loss. It was someone you recognized, someone whose absence you would have felt every single day. That's a completely different emotional experience than losing a distant acquaintance. And the evidence suggests that ancient humans felt it fully. They didn't just bury the dead and move on. They performed rituals. They returned to burial sites. In some cultures, they kept the bones of their ancestors nearby for years. At some sites, skulls were found with their features carefully reconstructed in plaster, ancient faces rebuilt to be remembered. The grief was real. The attachment was real. The effort to hold on was real. We often draw a mental line somewhere around 40 or 50,000 years ago when we start seeing cave paintings and musical instruments and more complex art. We call it the behavioral revolution, the moment humans became truly modern. But the burials at Escul and Cafse pushed the timeline much further back, and Cima de los Huesos pushes it back even further. It suggests that something we consider deeply human, the refusal to let someone simply disappear, isn't a recent invention. It may be one of the oldest things about us. So what did ancient humans do when someone died? They buried them, they placed objects with them, they covered them with flowers or red ochre or the things the person had loved in life. They carved thousands of beads and stitched them onto burial clothes. They carried bodies through darkness into deep chambers and left beautiful things with them. They grieved, they remembered, they believed in something they couldn't prove. And every funeral practice we have today, every grave, every ceremony, every flower left on a coffin, traces back to something those people started. The oldest human instinct might not be survival. It might be the need to say goodbye properly.